I'm sitting here at my kitchen table staring at my half-empty mug of coffee, trying to process the mess of emotions swirling inside me. It's been 3 days since that therapy session with my mother. 3 days, but it still feels like I'm holding my breath. It wasn't perfect and it didn't fix everything, but for a split second, just one tiny moment, I felt something I didn't think I'd ever feel in relation to her. Validation. To anyone else, this might seem insignificant. One admission of imperfection from a parent isn't something to get excited about. But for me, it was huge. For as long as I can remember, my mother has painted me as the problem. The overly sensitive, dramatic daughter who couldn't take a joke or who always read too much into things. Her love was conditional, her approval always just out of reach. And I spent years wondering if I was the crazy one. I always thought that if I could just be perfect enough, she'd see me, really see me, and things would be different. But that was never going to happen. She didn't want to see me. She wanted me to exist in a way that made her feel good about herself. She never admitted it outright, of course. That would have been too much of a concession. But over the years, I've learned how to read between the lines. Taking her to therapy wasn't even my idea, not really. It was the therapist's. After a few sessions of me venting about how deeply frustrating my relationship with my mother was, Dr. Patterson suggested gently that I consider inviting Diane to one of our meetings. I resisted, of course. I was terrified of what would happen if I did. What if she shut me down completely? What if she stormed out? What if she made me feel even crazier than I already did? The idea of her sitting there, listening to me expose all the years of emotional neglect, was terrifying. But I agreed. If there was even the smallest chance that I could get her to listen, really listen, I had to try. So I called her. And of course, she said yes, though I'm sure she only agreed because she assumed it would be yet another one of my phases that would eventually blow over. I didn't expect her to take it seriously. I didn't expect anything from her. But somehow, I thought maybe, just maybe, a neutral party might help her hear me. And when I walked into that room on the day of our session, I wasn't sure if I was ready. The weight of the moment settled heavy in my chest. Diane sat across from me, her arms folded, her posture defensive, but she was trying to appear calm. The therapist introduced herself again, and it was clear that this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. But something about that moment felt different. For once, we weren't in her living room or at a family gathering where I was just the inconvenient daughter. We were in a space designed for honesty, a space where, maybe for the first time, my voice could be heard. My mother started off as expected, distant, dismissive, always the one in control. She didn't look at me when she spoke. Her words were polite, but cold. She said things like, "I don't see why we're here. I'm just fine. It's Emily who has the problem." I felt that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I braced myself for the usual accusations, the defensiveness, the blame. But then something happened. I don't even know how it started. Dr. Patterson had asked her about something, some small moment in our past, and for some reason my mother answered differently than usual. She didn't deflect. She didn't make me the villain. She said, "I guess I can be hard on her sometimes. I don't always know how to make her feel good enough." For a split second, my heart stopped. Did she just say that? Did she actually admit that she's been hard on me? That it's not all my fault? I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought she'd tear me down in front of the therapist or get angry or storm out, but instead she sat there almost unnervingly quiet, and for a brief moment I felt like I could breathe. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one, but it was a crack in the facade, a glimpse of something I didn't think she was capable of. She was admitting, albeit reluctantly, that she wasn't perfect. She was admitting that sometimes, just sometimes, she'd gotten it wrong. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't the crazy one. It was almost surreal. I remember the exact moment her words hit me, like a burst of air on a cold day, unexpected, almost shocking. I wanted to say something right away, to challenge her, to ask her what she meant by hard on me, or to demand a real apology. But something stopped me. I think I was too afraid to push it, too afraid that if I said the wrong thing, the moment would evaporate as quickly as it came. It was like I was seeing a tiny crack in a wall that had been impenetrable for decades, and I didn't want to break the spell. The therapist didn't let the moment pass, though. Dr. Patterson gently prompted her again, as if she knew how rare this was. "What do you mean by that, Diane? Can you elaborate?" The words were kind, but firm, like a subtle nudge to get her to dig deeper. My mother stiffened a little, but didn't shut down. Her voice became softer, more hesitant, which was unusual. "I don't know," she said, almost as if she was talking to herself. "I guess I've always felt like I had to push Emily, She's so sensitive, and I just thought if I pushed her harder, she'd be stronger." She shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with this line of thinking. "But maybe I pushed too much." I couldn't believe it. I almost wanted to laugh, but not out of joy, more from disbelief. There it was, the first time in my life I'd heard her admit that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong. But the admission was so half-hearted, so reluctant, that it felt almost like a trap. Was this real? Was she doing this because she was finally seeing things from my perspective? Or was it a calculated attempt to make herself seem less like the villain? I wanted to ask her so many things. Did you ever wonder how your words and actions made me feel? Did you ever consider how you might be contributing to my pain? But I didn't ask. I didn't need to. That one moment, that one tiny crack, was enough for me to realize something important. She was capable of seeing me. She was capable of acknowledging my hurt, even if only briefly, even if only in the most minimal way possible. The therapist didn't let the opportunity slip away, though. "It sounds like you're realizing the impact of your actions on Emily. What do you think about that, Diane?" My mother didn't respond immediately. She looked at the floor, like she was weighing the truth of her own words. For a long moment, the room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. I could see it in her eyes. She was processing, but not in the way I had hoped. She wasn't breaking down in guilt or sorrow. She wasn't showing empathy, but she was thinking, and that in itself was a small victory. The words she spoke next didn't feel like an apology, not by a long shot, but they were something. "I suppose I could have been more patient. I was just trying to prepare you for the world, Emily. I didn't want you to be weak." My chest tightened, and I felt tears prick the back of my eyes. Weak. She had always called me weak, but now, hearing her say it like that, like she had been trying to help me all along, made me want to scream. "No, Mom," I thought. "You were trying to control me. You were trying to mold me into someone who could never disappoint you, never make you feel anything less than perfect." But instead, I took a deep breath. I nodded slowly. "It's not about being weak. It's about being seen. It's about feeling like I'm enough, even when I'm not perfect." My voice was surprisingly steady, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. My mother didn't answer. She just stared at me, her lips pressed tight, as if she were still trying to make sense of my words. The therapist turned her attention to me, offering a soft smile, like she knew this moment. This small admission was a breakthrough, even if my mother didn't recognize it as such. The session ended shortly after that. There were no grand declarations, no emotional reunions. My mother didn't suddenly become the warm, loving mother I had always longed for. She didn't apologize, she didn't cry, and she certainly didn't give me any reassurance that she would change. But she had said something important, and that was enough for today. I can't stop thinking about that moment, the way my mother's words hung in the air, the way the crack in her armor opened just wide enough for me to see the truth, however small it was. It wasn't much, not in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a new kind of relationship with her, even if it was just a glimpse of what that might look like. For the first time in my life, I felt like my experiences weren't dismissed outright. I felt like for just a moment I wasn't the crazy one. But I still feel uneasy. Part of me wants to believe it's real. Part of me wants to believe that my mother can change, that she can really see me for who I am, not who she wants me to be. But another part of me wonders if this is just another manipulation, another way to make me feel like she's trying when she's really not. After all, it's not like she suddenly became empathetic or understanding. It was just a tiny crack in her wall, and I don't know if that means she's finally seeing me or if she's just playing a part because the therapist was there. As I drove home from the session, I felt like I was carrying a heavy weight inside me, relief and hope mixed with skepticism and doubt. It's hard to reconcile those two parts of myself, the part of me that wants to believe she can change, and the part that's been burned too many times to let myself hope for anything too big, but I can't deny that the validation I felt was real. Even though it wasn't much, even though it didn't fix everything, it was enough for me to breathe a little easier. Maybe I've been waiting my whole life for this, waiting for her to acknowledge me, for her to admit that she's hurt me, even if she can't fully own it yet. And maybe that's all I'm ever going to get from her. But for now, it's enough.